Beware of soothsaying pseudo-intellectuals.
The only people in this country who are not of white skin who cannot be deported, which is the central challenge of the black predicament. What did W.E.B. Du Bois say? He said the number one problem of the 21st century will be the color line. I'm going to take it a step further. The number one problem of the 21st century in America is what do we do with 40 million black folks who we do not want and cannot deport? This is why we are kept from realizing our true gifts and talents, because you cannot be sent back to Africa. Slavery psychologically destroyed your connection to your mother continent. For example, Chinese can be sent back to China. Latinos can be sent back to Cuba, Puerto Rico, or points beyond. Okay, an East Indian can be sent back to India. Okay, an Arab can be sent back to whatever Arabian nation from which they come. Where do you send African Americans back to?
Because I'll be lost in Africa.
Because your psychological connection was destroyed. You understand? So what do you do with these people?
Chick-fil-A in Africa, bro.
In colonial times, the colony of Georgia tried to ban the introduction of slavery there, but it was overruled in London. The Quakers in Pennsylvania even tried to put a high tax on the importation of slaves, but this too was overruled by the British government. Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln all sought a way out of this painful dilemma by sending the slaves back to Africa. However, most of the slaves in the United States had never seen Africa, and neither had their grandparents. They spoke no African languages and had no idea where their forebears had originated, on a continent more than twice the size of Europe, and one where local tribal origins were and still are crucial to one's acceptance and even toleration by other Africans. One concrete result of the Back to Africa movement was the establishment of Liberia on the West African coast, which the freed American blacks were sent under the James Monroe administration, from whom they named their capital, Monrovia. These first settlers were decimated by African diseases to which they had no biological resistance, which was another problem of trying to undo the past.
Cut it out. What do you do with these people who you do not want and cannot deport? You must create a system of genocide from within that seeks to remove them. That's why mass incarceration will never change. This is why people keep saying they spend millions of dollars on prison. It costs less to send them to school. So why are you spending this money on jail instead of sending them to school? Because this ain't about money. This is about an America that is free from black people.
So the question is, are alternatives to prison more effective in preventing criminals from repeating their crime? Dr. Umar can answer immediately because he already knows what answers are in vogue on the left, and the reason why conservatives won't accept those answers is because we are in line with the quote-unquote white supremacy, or we're just hard-hearted people who only want to punish black people. The rise in crime is far more consistent with the increasing prevalence of such grievance and resentment ideologies than poverty levels, which have been declining as crime rates rose. Resentments-based ideologies of cosmic justice are not confined to the intelligentsia, but trickle down to others. Unprovoked violence by young black gangs against white people on beaches and shopping malls or any public place have occurred in Philadelphia, New York, Denver, Chicago, Cleveland, Washington, Los Angeles, and any other place across the country, often with the attackers voicing anti-white invectives and mocking those they left injured or bleeding. But such episodes are often ignored or downplayed in the media. This preemptive assertion that it is the system, something external created by the larger society, that caused the problem, arbitrarily puts off limits at the outset the very possibility that the problem just might be elsewhere. Collective responsibility is put upon those of the larger society. There is clearly something in the circumstances into which many black males are born that makes it far more likely that they will commit crimes than is true of the population in general, including the majority of the black population that does not end up behind bars. If it's because of poverty, then there's clearly less poverty today than in 1950, when the imprisonment rate among black males was lower. Only 5% of college-educated African Americans have spent time in prison, while the imprisonment rate for black male high school dropouts is nearly 50 times the national average. Children with parents in prison are 7 times more likely to be in prison at some point in time in their life. None of this supports the cause that this is an external system rather than an internal counterproductive culture, which perhaps aided and abetted by outsiders who excuse or even celebrate that counterproductive culture. From 1994 to the 21st century, the poverty rate among black marriages was below 10%. So are these blacks living in a different external system, or do they have a different internal culture representing different values within their families? Today's high rate of incarceration is blamed on the drug laws, tighter sentencing rules, and a general failure of society is to blame, except for those members of society who actually commit the crime. It is certainly no benefit of blacks in general to take a sympathetic view of those blacks who commit crimes, since most of the crimes are committed by other blacks, especially murder. The black victims of the crimes are not responsible.
Police extermination fees that. Abortion, which is the #1 killer. Most people don't understand this. More black babies are murdered in the stomach than they are on the street corner. And why? Because a black woman growing up in poverty with already a couple of children, seeing how hard it is to make ends meet, is probably going to think about potentially terminating that pregnancy. It's not a moral issue. It's a political, economic, white supremacist issue. Why bring another life in this world so they can only be murdered by the police like Trayvon?
Or just struggle in the hood.
Oh yes, the argument of inconvenience. The left will use this argument to say women are not able to raise kids in the circumstances proper to the child, guaranteeing them the best possible opportunity. This argument is not about stage of development or bodily autonomy. It's about the living circumstances or the future circumstances of the child are insufficient to the needs of the child, so therefore you should kill the child. That position does not change the calculus. In addition, this argument applies equally to kids who are born and kids who are unborn, which leads to the green lighting of infanticide based in circumstance. I don't believe that you being a burden on somebody is justifications for killing you. There are literally thousands of kids around the world growing up in rather unenviable circumstances, and killing them would be murder. The real question about abortion is whether this is a kid or not. The tying of social condition to abortion is a particular egregious moral error.
But here's the point I need y'all to get. The reason we're struggling so much as a people is because we're not given systematic access to wealth. We are systematically denied access to wealth. Do you understand? So we can't build that hospital they built. We can open up 10 supermarkets. I can't get 10 gas stations in 3 weeks because you're going to routinely deny me access to wealth. Because if I finance your empowerment, that disrupts my system of extermination and genocide. You cannot kill a people who you are financially empowering. So we are kept without access to wealth. That's why the hood is full of mom and pop stores. That's why the hood is full of struggling businesses, because America has a policy where you do not empower black people for their own benefit. Any other minority? Yes. Why? Because if they get out of hand, they can be sent home. The black man cannot be sent home.
The turn down rate for a white applicant for a mortgage is higher than the turn down rate for a Japanese or Chinese applicant for a mortgage. So are banks discriminating against whites in favor of Asian Americans? No, that's absurd. It's because their credit scores are better. Asians often live below their means and they save more. Anyone who has ever applied for a loan knows that there are numerous factors besides the income which are considered. One of the most obvious being the network of the applicants. Data from the U.S. Census showed that blacks average lower net worth than whites in the same tax bracket. Even blacks in the highest income bracket do not have as much net worth as whites. If you have a poor credit score, you're not going to get a loan. Obama was one of many Chicago activists who pioneered the national subprime real estate bubble, which contributed to the financial scandal which has affected the whole country. Barack Obama, along with other activists, pushed banks to make loans to low-income African Americans even though they knew they had no ability to pay off these loans. Obama represented approximately 186 clients who sued Citibank. That was effectively the beginning of the real estate bubble, which has affected thousands of homeowners today. Roughly half of the 186 African American clients in this landmark mortgage discrimination lawsuit against Citibank have since gone bankrupt or received foreclosure notices. As few as 19 of the 186 clients still own homes with clean credit ratings. So since the mortgage bubble burst, some of his former clients are calling for a policy reversal. John Buchanan, a former client, said, "If you see some people who don't make enough money to afford mortgages, why would you give them a loan?" He then went on to say, "There should be some type of regulation against giving people loans they can't afford." Go figure.
Slavery is older than America. America was born on July 4th, 1776. Slavery in the colonies began on August the 20th, 1619.
So, the 1619 Project is something put forward by the New York Times. It's not good history. There are 4 Pulitzer Prize winning historians who have said this is not good history. The basic argument is that the United States was not founded in 1776 under the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The country was actually founded in 1619 with the importation of slaves to the American shores, because that's when the first African African-American slaves arrived in the United States in 1619. However, in 1619, the first Africans brought into captivity in colonial Virginia in 1619 became indentured servants like the white indentured servants who were common in colonial America. In 1600, Anthony Johnson was a black Angolian known for achieving wealth in the early 17th century colony of Virginia. He was one of the first African-American property owners, and he had rights to legally own slaves, recognized by the Virginia courts. Held as an indentured servant in 1621, he earned his freedom after several years and granted land by the colony. The stupid idea that the entire history of America is a history of a system that is endemically white supremacist and that all of the Declaration of Independence was basically a lie is asinine. Dr. Umar believes that the principles that all men were created equal was a lie. Even the idea that we have rights that pre-exist government is a lie also. Dr. Umar would have you believe that the Constitution was built in order to enshrine white supremacy, and now evolution has taken its place. This pseudo-intellectual essentially is making the argument that from 1619 to 2023 is a continuum of that lie. These woketards would say that although racism has gone underground a little bit, it's still very much present and implicit in all of our systems. In reality, the story of America is trying to fulfill the promises of the Declaration of Independence over time and make those promises available to everybody. The act of prohibiting importation of slaves took effect in 1801, January 1st, and this legislation was promoted by Thomas Jefferson. In 1856, the first Republican Party convention promised to defeat, quote, those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery. The story of America is the Declaration of Independence and those principles that we shall basically agree on because these are good principles. Think about it. Free speech, free assembly, and all the freedoms we enjoy within our Constitution. These principles brought about more freedom and prosperity more than anything else, and also helped us overcome sins that are present in all of humanity. However, the 1619 Project says that all that was just basically nonsense, and that America is just a history of whites keeping blacks down, and that no progress has essentially been made, and that if there is any progress, it's mostly a lie. So every disparity now can be attributed to historical disparities between whites and blacks. America's legacy of slavery is but a fraction compared to the worldwide crusade against slavery. No other nation ended slavery in the same way the United States did. The cost of abolishing slavery was enormous. Lincoln had to borrow billions to pay for it. And also in terms of human life, 360,000 human soldiers died in order to free 4 million slaves. That math works out to be 1 soldier in blue for every 10 slaves freed.
No, I think they would if we had a leader. See, I think with us, who is the leader? Who do we look up to?
Church. And why is church leadership so popular?
It's not
But
church.
Envy, here's the question.
It's not church.
I agree with you. But sarcastically,
Right.
why is church leadership so popular in the black community? Because church leaders are the only leaders who don't ask you to do anything
They sell
except
hope.
show up and give money. They sell
sell
hope,
hope.
not substance.
At one point, the black church was a focal point of everything for us as a people. It was a place where slaves gathered, and they made plans for the future as well as plans to escape, and the slave owners would allow them that space of freedom. But they would also put a person in charge as an overseer of the meeting to report back to him what is being said. Also, the church was a place where businesses was launched, a schoolhouse for the children where they would learn to read and write from the Bible. A lot of churches were burned because they were the strongholds of the black community. Today, the church has lost its salt entirely. The black church today does nothing for the community. When was the last time a black pastor said he was donating a love offering to someone in need? They should not be leeching off of people who are already struggling. Grifters. Black people are the most over-churched people in the country, and yet we have high crime in the immediate vicinity of every church in this country. Black pastors are so invested in preaching this prosperity doctrine, which gives people a 2 to 3 hour emotional high, then as soon as they leave, and they go right back to their hedonistic pursuits.
You're not going to follow. If Dr. King was in America today, I do not think Dr. King could achieve half of what he achieved 50 years ago, because you're dealing with a new Negro who has no obligation to the collective, no interest in the progress of his people, and is intensely egotistical and individualistic about his pursuits. We don't care about racism until it knocks on our front door.
Martin Luther King was made for TV. By the age of 12, Dr. King said he rejected the deity of Christ and the resurrection. He graduated high school at the age of 15 and went off to college and had no interest in being a pastor. King said he would not accept the gospel if he were to accept the gospel gospel, it would be the liberal interpretation of the spiritual gospel. A lot of people believe that Martin Luther King wanted to go to a conservative theological seminary, but he was rejected because of his color. But that is far from the truth. Some of Dr. King's liberal professors believe Dr. King was precisely the kind of Negro minister that could take their ideology to the stubborn Negro South. Dr. King learned about nonviolent agitation from one of his communist colleagues. He used symbolism in his rhetoric that would move the crowd. Symbols of patriotism, religion, symbols of grievance. He knew that as soon as you earn the trust of your audience, they will follow you anywhere. Martin Luther King deceptively infiltrated the church because he understood that you could shift the black thought and how it engages in civil rights once you gain the endorsement of the church. Dr. J.H. Jackson was the head of the National Baptist Convention, which was the largest black church convention of the world. He would preach about repentance, trusting God, being a man, and being productive. Martin Luther King, rather, thought it was more imperative to challenge the system. That caused an internal shift in the mindset of black men. To the extent that you can make people feel discontent and disenchanted, they will become angry. And thus, the Marxist ideology was appealing. Dr. King infused his rhetoric from using God to, well, it's kind of like God, but in some aspects, you are God. So why do you need a God? Which ultimately leads to nihilism, what we see today.
You says Black Lives Matter. I work here part-time. Plus, I'm a part owner of this store. You said Black Lives Matter. Why don't you choke me? I'm black. Look what you did to my store.